Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey there, Herman and Corn. Would like to get your advice and sage words upon a medical topic. Of course, one should consult their doctor for medical advice, and indeed, I've done so, but they can only go so far in giving you information, and sometimes it's very sparse, which is where I think that doing your own research and reaching out to knowledgeable sloth and donkeys like Herman and Corn sometimes has its own independent value. Herman and Corn, I've been taking a medication for a couple of years to help me sleep. And it began when, as I mentioned in some episodes, I moved into this place that we're currently living in, and super noisy, incredibly loud, honking, traffic, you name it. And it was incredibly hard to sleep and also really stressful. So I started on this drug called Seroquel, which is a low dosage of a drug that sounds very scary. It's an antipsychotic, but it's commonly used off-label for sleep. And it's one of those things that it's never really a good time to go without sleep. Like when you're thinking about tapering off the drug and you get told that, yeah, it's doable, but it's safe, but you're going to have a hard time sleeping for a while. And I think that fear of, it's not really even the fear, but just that looming insomnia has kind of held me back for way longer than I need to be on this or want to be on this. I've definitely succeeded in not taking it for a few days. But then I say, you know what, I could really use a good night's sleep. What I'd love to get your advice on, Herman and Corn, is for those who are tapering off this drug or other sleep medications. While your neurochemistry is adjusting, you're going to be having a hard or very hard time getting to sleep. But I believe that it can be done. I'm just not sure exactly what to do when you wake up in the middle of the night, you can't get back to sleep. What is a recommendation there? Are you supposed to do something like, is reading a book a bad idea, going for a walk, or is that the kind of thing that will just make it harder? I don't really know what to do when that inevitably happens. We'll talk about one other drug I'd love to get off in another episode, omeprazole. But for today's one, let's talk about the art of tapering safely and successfully of sleeping medications under, of course, the supervision of your prescribing physician. Over to you, Herman and Corn.
You know, Herman, I was looking at the clock last night around 2 a.m, just staring at the ceiling. And it occurred to me that sleep is probably the most fragile superpower we have. 1 minute, you're a functional human being, and the next, if the chemistry is just slightly off, you are basically a ghost haunting your own hallway.
It is a delicate biological dance, Corn, truly, and I think that is why today's topic is so heavy for a lot of people. Herman Poppleberry here, by the way, for anyone joining us for the first time. We are diving into a really personal and technical challenge today. Our housemate Daniel sent us a prompt about a journey he is on, and honestly, it is one that millions of people quietly deal with every year.
Yeah, Daniel was asking about the process of tapering off sleep medications, specifically Seroquel. He's been taking it for a few years because, as anyone who has visited us in Jerusalem knows, our neighborhood can be incredibly loud. Between the traffic on Jaffa Street and the late-night energy of the markets, he started using it to find some peace. But now he is ready to move on, and he is hitting that wall where the neurochemistry starts pushing back.
It is a tough spot to be in. And we should say right at the top, we are going to talk about the science and the strategies, but this is absolutely a conversation that has to happen in tandem with the doctor. Daniel mentioned he is doing this under medical supervision, which is the only way to play this game safely. Seroquel, or Quetiapine as it is known generically, is a serious piece of pharmacology.
It really is. And I think that is a good place to start, Herman. Most people think of Seroquel as a sleep aid because that is how it is often used off-label at low doses, but its primary identity is an atypical antipsychotic. Why is it that a drug designed for something as intense as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder becomes the go-to for someone who just has noisy neighbors?
That is the big question. It comes down to what we call receptor affinity. At very high doses, like 300 to 800 milligrams, Seroquel hits dopamine and serotonin receptors hard. But at the low doses used for sleep, say 12.5 to 50 milligrams, it acts primarily as a massive antihistamine. It binds to the H1 histamine receptors in the brain with incredible strength.
So it is basically like taking a very, very powerful Benadryl.
In a sense, yes, but with a much longer half-life and some other messy baggage. It is often called a dirty drug in pharmacology, not because it is bad, but because it is not very selective. It hits a lot of different targets. When you've been on it for years, like Daniel has, your brain has actually changed its physical structure to compensate for that constant blockade of histamine.
This is what Daniel was getting at when he mentioned the neurochemistry adjusting. If you've been blocking those receptors for years, your brain probably grew more receptors, or became more sensitive to histamine to try to maintain some kind of balance, right?
Exactly. It is called upregulation. Your brain is trying to find homeostasis. So, when you start to take the drug away, you suddenly have an abundance of sensitive receptors and a flood of histamine. It is like turning a fire hose on a thirsty plant. Your brain becomes hyper-alert. That is why the insomnia that follows tapering is not just regular, I cannot sleep. It is often described as a wired, heart-pounding wakefulness, sometimes even accompanied by physical symptoms like itching or nausea because histamine is active all over the body.
That sounds exhausting just thinking about it. So, Daniel's big concern is that middle of the night wake up. You have cut your dose, you manage to fall asleep, but then at 3 a.m. your eyes snap open. You are wide awake, the neurochemistry is swirling, and you are stuck. Daniel asked if he should read a book, or go for a walk, or if that just makes it worse. What does the research say about that specific moment of crisis?
This is where we get into the art of sleep hygiene versus stimulus control therapy. The old advice was always just stay in bed, keep your eyes closed, and try to relax. But modern sleep science, especially cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, says the exact opposite. If you are awake for more than 20 minutes and you are feeling frustrated or alert, you have to get out of bed.
Why is that? It feels so counterintuitive. You want to sleep, so you stay where the sleep happens, right?
You would think so, but the brain is a master of association. If you spend hours lying in bed frustrated, your brain starts to associate the bed with being awake and annoyed. We call this conditioned arousal. The bed becomes a place of stress rather than a place of rest. So, to answer Daniel's question, yes, you should get up. But what you do when you get up is critical.
So, is a walk a good idea? Or is that too much physical stimulation?
A walk is definitely too much because it raises your core body temperature. Remember, your body temperature needs to drop for you to stay in deep sleep. If you go for a brisk walk at 3 a.m, you are telling your metabolic systems that the day has started. The goal should be what we call low arousal activities.
Like reading?
Reading is great, but only if it is a physical book with a dim, warm light. No tablets, no phones. The blue light from a screen will suppress melatonin production and make the neurochemical adjustment even harder. You want something boring, or at least something that does not make your heart race. Do not read a high-stakes thriller. Read a biography of a 19th century tax collector in rural Prussia.
I actually have a few of those if Daniel needs to borrow one. But seriously, what about the psychological side of this? When you are tapering off a medication, there is this looming fear. You are almost waiting for the insomnia to hit. Does that expectation make the actual chemical withdrawal worse?
Absolutely. It is a feedback loop. You have the biological withdrawal, which is the histamine rebound we talked about, and then you have the psychological anxiety of, I am not on my full dose, so I probably won't sleep. This creates a state of hypervigilance. You are basically monitoring your own brain for signs of wakefulness, which, ironically, keeps you awake.
It reminds me of what we discussed back in episode 322 when we talked about the transition tax. We were talking about moving from work to home, but there is a transition tax here too, isn't there? The cost of moving from a medicated state to a natural state. It is not a free pass. You have to pay that tax in the form of a few rough nights.
That is a perfect way to put it. And the goal of a successful taper is to make that tax as low as possible. You do not want to pay it all at once in a massive lump sum. That is what happens when people quit cold turkey, which is dangerous and often leads to a total breakdown in sleep that lasts for weeks.
So let's talk about the mechanics of the taper itself. Daniel mentioned doing this with a physician, which is great. But often, even doctors suggest drops that are too big for the brain to handle comfortably. I have read about the difference between linear tapering and hyperbolic tapering. Can you break that down?
This is where the nerdy details really matter. Most people think if you are on 50 milligrams, you go to 40, then 30, then 20, and so on. That is a linear taper. But that is not how drugs bind to your receptors. The relationship between the dose and the receptor occupancy is a curve, not a straight line.
Meaning the jump from 5 milligrams to 0 is actually much bigger for the brain than the jump from 50 to 40.
Exactly. It is wild when you see the graphs. At low doses, every milligram counts for way more in terms of how many receptors are being covered. This is why the last few milligrams are the hardest. So, as you get lower, you actually have to slow down. This is the hyperbolic method. You might reduce by 10% of your current dose every few weeks rather than a fixed amount of milligrams. It takes longer, but it gives the neurochemistry time to catch up.
That requires a lot of patience. If you've been on something for years, like Daniel has, your brain has built an entire infrastructure around that drug. You're basically decommissioning a power plant while trying to keep the lights on in the city.
That is such a good analogy. And while you are decommissioning that plant, you need backup generators. For Daniel, those backup generators are things like light exposure and temperature control. One of the best things he can do to help his brain recalibrate is to get massive amounts of bright sunlight as soon as he wakes up.
To reset the circadian rhythm?
Yes. It tells the brain, okay, the histamine flood is happening now, during the day, when it is supposed to happen. It helps anchor the cycle. And then, in the evening, he needs to be aggressive about darkness. We are talking total blackout.
I think Daniel is already pretty good about that, but it is harder when your brain is in that hypersensitive state. Everything feels louder and brighter. He mentioned the noisy environment was the reason he started Seroquel in the first place. If he is tapering off, those noises are going to feel like thunderclaps.
Right, so he needs to double down on the physical environment. High-quality earplugs, white noise machines, maybe even those acoustic panels for the walls. You have to remove the external triggers while the internal triggers are so volatile.
What about other supplements? People always jump to melatonin or magnesium when they are struggling with sleep. Is that helpful during a Seroquel taper, or is it just adding more noise to the system?
It is a bit of a minefield. Magnesium glycinate can be helpful because it supports the GABA system, which is the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. It can help take the edge off that wired feeling. But melatonin is tricky. If you take too much, you can end up with a hormone hangover the next day. I usually tell people to stick to the basics first. Fix the light, fix the temperature, and fix the behavior.
Let's go back to that 3 a.m. moment. Daniel gets out of bed. He goes to the living room. He reads a boring book in dim light. At what point does he go back to bed?
Only when he feels that specific wave of sleepiness. Not just tiredness, but sleepiness. There is a difference. Tiredness is I am exhausted and my body hurts. Sleepiness is my eyelids are heavy and I am about to nod off. If he goes back to bed before he is sleepy, he is just going to start the frustration cycle all over again.
And if he never feels sleepy? If he stays up until 5 in the morning?
Then he stays up until 5. And this is the hardest part of the advice. He still has to wake up at his normal time. If he sleeps in until 10 a.m. to make up for the lost time, he has just pushed his entire sleep window forward and guaranteed that he won't be sleepy the next night. You have to protect the wake-up time at all costs.
That is brutal. That is the true transition tax. You are basically walking through fire for a few days to get your brain back.
It is, but the brain is incredibly plastic. It wants to heal. It wants to reach that natural homeostasis. It just needs a gentle, slow path to get there. I think the psychological win for Daniel will be the first time he wakes up at 3 a.m., goes to the couch, reads for 30 minutes, feels sleepy, goes back to bed, and actually falls back asleep without a pill. Once you do that, the fear starts to dissolve.
It is about building evidence for yourself, proving to your brain that it still knows how to do this. Because after years on medication, you start to believe that the drug is the only thing keeping the lights out. You forget that your body has millions of years of evolutionary programming designed to make you sleep.
Exactly. Seroquel is a crutch, and there is no shame in using a crutch when your leg is broken. If the environment was too noisy and stressful, Daniel needed that support. But now that he is ready to walk on his own, he has to trust that his leg has healed, even if it feels a little shaky at first.
I also think there is something to be said for the emotional state during a taper. Withdrawal from these kinds of meds can make you irritable, or even a little depressed. It is not just about the sleep, it is about the overall mood stability.
Very true. Histamine and dopamine are deeply involved in mood. When those levels are fluctuating, you might feel like you are on an emotional roller coaster. I think it is important for Daniel and anyone else in this position to tell the people they live with, "Hey, I am tapering off my meds. I might be a bit of a mess for a few weeks. Please be patient."
Well, he told us, and we are definitely on board. We will keep the kitchen quiet and the coffee strong for those early mornings.
That is the best kind of support. And you know, Corn, I was reading a study about the long-term effects of using these low-dose antipsychotics for sleep. It turns out that while they're effective in the short term, they often lose their effectiveness over time because of that receptor upregulation we talked about. People end up needing higher and higher doses just to get the same 4 hours of sleep.
So it is a diminishing return. Eventually, the side effects start to outweigh the benefits. Things like weight gain or that morning grogginess that feels like your brain is wrapped in cotton.
The Seroquel fog is very real. Many people find that once they are fully off it, they feel like they have woken up from a dream they didn't know they were in. Their cognitive clarity returns. Their energy levels stabilize. It is a massive quality of life improvement.
That is the light at the end of the tunnel. It is not just about being off a pill. It is about being more present in your own life.
Precisely. Now, I want to touch on one more thing Daniel asked about. He mentioned the art of tapering successfully. We talked about the hyperbolic curve, but there is also the scheduling aspect. Some people try to skip days, taking it Monday, skipping Tuesday. What do you think about that?
I have heard that is actually one of the worst things you can do.
It is. It is like a chemical yo-yo. You are basically shocking your system over and over again. You want a steady, predictable decline. Skipping days creates these massive peaks and valleys in your blood plasma levels. It makes the rebound insomnia much more intense. Stick to a daily dose. Just make that dose smaller and smaller.
That makes sense. It is about stability. You are trying to convince your brain that everything is fine, nothing is changing too fast.
Right. And if you hit a wall, say you drop from 25 milligrams to 20, and you just cannot function, there is no shame in staying at 20 for a month, or even going back to 22. A taper is not a race. It is a negotiation with your nervous system.
I like that. A negotiation. And sometimes the nervous system is a very tough negotiator. You have to be willing to sit at the table for a long time.
It really is. I think we should also mention that for some people, switching to a liquid version of the medication can help with those tiny late-stage reductions. It is much easier to measure out a 5% drop with a syringe than it is to try to cut a tiny pill into eighths with a kitchen knife. Some people even use compounding pharmacies to get exact, custom doses.
That is a great practical tip. I have seen people trying to use pill cutters on those tiny tablets, and it usually ends up with half the pill crumbling into dust. Then you have no idea what dose you are actually taking.
Exactly. Precision is your friend when you are near the end of the taper.
So, to summarize the plan for Daniel and others, work with a doctor, go slower than you think you need to, and use the hyperbolic method. When the 3 a.m. wake-up happens, get out of bed, do something boring in the dark, and wait for the actual sleepiness to return.
And don't forget the morning sun. That is your anchor.
It is a lot to manage, but it feels doable when you break it down into the mechanics. It is not a mystery. It is just biology.
It is beautiful, complex, sometimes frustrating biology, but it is also resilient.
Well, I hope that gives Daniel some solid ground to stand on. It is a journey for sure. And hey, to everyone listening, if you have gone through something similar or if you have found strategies that work for you, we would love to hear about them. This is a community effort.
It really is. And if you are enjoying these deep dives into the weird prompts Daniel sends our way, please consider leaving us a review on your favorite podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find the show, and we love reading your feedback.
It really does make a difference. You can find all our past episodes, including that one on the transition tax, at myweirdprompts.com. We have a full archive there and an RSS feed if you want to subscribe.
We have covered everything from the neurochemistry of habits to the history of Jerusalem's architecture, so there is plenty to explore.
Definitely. Well, Herman, I think I am actually feeling a bit sleepy after all this talk of 19th century tax collectors.
Mission accomplished.
Thanks for the insights, Herman Poppleberry. This has been My Weird Prompts.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We will see you in the next one.
Stay curious and sleep well.
Or at least taper well.
Exactly. Catch you later.
Bye, everyone.
You know, I was just thinking about the earplug situation for Daniel. We should really look into those high-fidelity ones that musicians use. They block the sharp transients of the traffic, but don't feel as isolating as the foam ones.
That is actually a great idea. It reduces the sensory input without making you feel like you are underwater. We can look into that after the show.
Deal. Alright, signing off for real this time.
See ya.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.